Hello, welcome to this masterclass with me, Terri Lee-Shield. I'm talking today about grooming and transactional relationships. But this is a really important topic and it's something that's close to my heart. It's been a personal journey for me to unpack the nature of transactional relationships in my life and to understand grooming process. So this is something that feels really important to me to share. This masterclass is going to delve in a little bit deeper about what is grooming, why we don't really understand it, and how we can make a change to avoid creating dynamics of transactional relationships, especially between adults and children. This one is most harmful. Transactional relationships aren't healthy and helpful in most circumstances unless they're declared. And I might as well start at the beginning. We are very used to performing within transactional relationships. And transactional relationships, what that means is that I'm going to give something in order to receive something. And if I receive something, I need to give something back. It's this sort of tit for tat exchange. There's no problem with that, particularly when that is a very obvious, when it's a declared transactional relationship, when we make agreements around that. When it's not manipulative, these relationships are not only helpful, they are a part of life. They've become so normalized, especially the way our economy works these days. And I think that's why transactional relationships have become particularly blurred because we are used to transactional relationships very often in the realms of work and money, finances, even social services, even the constructs we create of relationships between, say, a teacher and a student is transactional. A teacher shows up because they get paid and because they're going to receive something for showing up, and they're going to give an agreed curriculum. They're going to share an agreed knowledge. The student turns up because they're going to gain knowledge. And so there's this transaction that goes on, and it's kind of, although now we could have a whole conversation about the fact that that is enforced, but there's mutual gains involved in that. So because of our economy, because a lot of people work, and because we have been trained through our schooling to perform for work, we become very comfortable in this transactional relationship arena. Transactional relationships have slipped into personal relationships and caregiving relationships. Now, the reason this is a problem, because in a caregiving relationship, you can't always get something for what you give. If you're showing up in a caring scenario, in a love relationship, or in a guardianship relationship as a parent or a guardian of a child, you should not be expecting to get anything from that relationship because you are the giver. You are offering something that can't be returned. When we are caring for a child, when we are responsible for a child and guarding their growth, their progress, nurturing them, protecting them, we're in a position of power, and we can't expect that child to be able to give us the same amount of energy as what we give them. There's a different power dynamic involved with a child. You could same I suppose when someone gets much older or if somebody is disabled and they need that care and they're not able to reciprocate with the same amount of energy or with the same amount of awareness, with the same amount of responsibility as you are bringing if you're the carer. This is where transactional nature of relationships becomes dangerous at times. And it's actually slipped into this relationship. Often we see it now because of things like paid schooling, paid care, paid childcare. People are in it because they're getting something out of it, as opposed to being in that relationship in order to give and to not expect anything in return. Grooming is more complex than that. Grooming is a deeper level to that. Grooming is an extreme form of transactional relationships, but the reason why we miss grooming often as a society, in families, in communities, is because of the way transactional relationships have slipped into our normality. And because of that, it just makes it harder to identify or see or notice or give weight to the effect of grooming. So grooming on a deeper level is when an adult uses that position of power, uses that position of authority, control, responsibility to actually create an environment that's so beneficial to the child, but the child then feels they have to give something back in order to maintain it. Or that the child is afraid of, if they don't perform in a certain way, if they don't give what is expected of them, they'll lose that relationship completely. So this is often, when we talk about abuse in relationships, this is often the relationship that's created. When you hear about grooming in an abuse scenario, what's normally happened is that the adult has basically given or built a relationship, can be over a long period of time even, that's solely only based on pleasurable experiences. So that child has associated pleasure, associated receiving, association of feeling of trust and safety with that person. And that grooming process is when that feeling has been applied to that relationship. So the relationship becomes really important to the child. Particularly, this is when it's highlighted a lot in neglectful scenarios. If a child feels like they're neglected at home, if they are neglected emotionally, physically, then if somebody gives them a lot of attention, gives them a lot of time, energy, it can be gifts, praise even, if that's been neglected from them, they're going to attach a lot more importance to that relationship and feel like that relationship gives more to them than what would be required and safe in a normal caregiving relationship. When we're caring for children, there is, of course, going to be times when the child doesn't perform as we'd like. They're children, they're growing, they're learning, they're going to misbehave, they're going to mess things up, they're going to cause situations that mean that we have to step in and give even more. And that's a normal part of growing. And it's also a very normal part of caregiving to express the learning in that, and to have an ebb and flow of positive and negative emotions, interactions in a relationship, even without any abuse and neglect. Of course, that's part of life, living and child rearing and taking care of children. When we use this positive reinforcement constantly to create an environment where the child actually then stops being themselves, being able to be themselves out of fear of losing the relationship, this is where the power has been abused. Particularly then, this is where often people take advantage to abuse a child. That's why they're, pedophiles, for example, take a time to create a grooming process. They take a time to reinforce these feelings of goodness, of pleasure, of safety, security. Because when they then slowly start to introduce unsafe situations, when they start to introduce activities that the child's natural instincts wouldn't want to go along with, the child doesn't want to risk losing that relationship. The child is afraid of losing that connection and all the positive attention or the positive reinforcement they've been getting from the relationship. So this is why it's important in healthy caregiving relationships that there's not that transaction there, that if a child feels unsafe, uncomfortable, unsure, if a child makes a mistake, if they have a negative emotional response, if they need to learn something new, that we can teach that without withdrawing our attention, our affection, or any of the positive nurture and protection that we are duty bound to provide with child when they're in our care. And one of the ways that this is kind of snuck into our society a lot is through over positive reinforcement, but then using the withdrawal of that as some sort of punishment or threat to be able to gain compliance and obedience from your child. A child should always be free to express their discomfort or withdraw from a situation, to withdraw their consent. Because we all have that right, we all have that innate human right to a safe environment and to honor our own experience and honor our own bodies. And often what parents do when they're trying to discipline, when they're trying to reinforce good behavior, is actually withdraw the very basis of the nurture and protection they need to provide as the guardian. Or we use a threat of a removal of benefit in order to gain some sort of compliance. And that's not a healthy way to create a dynamic for a child. It's also not a way that the child's actually going to learn or grow or even understand why they need to adjust their behavior. They may well just adjust the behavior, but it's not because they want to, it's because they're afraid of the threat. And then when that becomes normalized, then that child is wide open to being groomed in a more serious, harmful way. This idea of separating goodness and badness based on compliance and obedience is setting a ground for grooming. Your child should know if they misbehave, if they do something that harms someone else, they should know that that's inappropriate. It doesn't mean that you're going to then inappropriately withdraw their attention, their affection, their nurture and protection that they need in order to grow and thrive. So this idea, adding a layer of you must do this to be rewarded, and if you don't do it, you're going to miss out on good things, basically is the basis of grooming. And it is a transactional basis of a relationship that can prove complex to overcome, especially if that then does lead to a misunderstanding in a child around relationships or dangerous situations of abuse. This idea of tit for tat relationships, this idea that if I do something you like, you must do something I like in exchange. And understanding that in its essence is really important for children and also for adults. But to understand that just because somebody else enjoys something doesn't mean we have to comply, doesn't mean we have to go along with it because we've shared an experience that we both enjoy. The idea or the fundamental underlying idea that well, I've done something you enjoy, so you should do something I enjoy, is the messy area where grooming can occur, where grooming becomes much easier for a child and that can lead to abuse. This is why it's important the child can always say no, can always withdraw consent, and also understands that their experience and how they feel in experience is really important, and that can be expressed. And that means that they can't always be compliant or obedient to meet your preference. So this is why I feel this is so important, because we often want that because it's easier. We want a child to just comply. But actually, if we don't address the fact that that could be harming them, it could be causing them real complex feelings of discomfort that they don't know how to express, it can lead to traumatization. And then that traumatization or the repression of their emotions, like I say, can lead to more serious abuse. They become a target for that because they don't know how to express a no. And predators, people who do want to abuse and harm children, see that straight away. They can see a child that can't say no. They'll pick out the good kids because they know they're not going to put up a fight, they're not going to withdraw, or they're not going to tell on them, or whatever it is. We are autonomous, and this taking away the autonomy of a child when they're young and denying that ability to consent is really harmful. Now, there are times, it's complex because there are times when as adults, as a caregiver, we have to take away that autonomy, because otherwise it could lead to a dangerous situation. The child's going to run across a road or touch a fire or eat something harmful, hit another child, whatever it is. There are times we're going to have to override their consent. And it's another duty of ours to explain why. Not because that means you're bad or this is bad. Explain why. This is harmful because of this. I'm doing this because of this. And that's enforcing a discipline without any threat. Protecting a child is part of loving them. So enforcing a discipline of no and explaining why is loving, it's protective. So to be able to discipline without any sort of threat, without removing approval of the child and highlighting that it's the behavior that's harmful and why, then is learning and much more secure relationships in a healthy way. Creating that safe container and that safe space for children is how we combat grooming. It's how we combat that dangerous, abusive situation, because the child understands and recognizes what is a safe scenario, what is a safe relationship, what is a safe space where I can be myself and I can honor myself and I can say no. And that foundational self-esteem, that foundational confidence, and that foundational skill of being able to say no is really important in all areas of consent for a child growing. And that is how we combat these dangerous, abusive situations as best we can, just because it feeds the innate knowing, the instincts of the child to be able to respond, this doesn't feel right, so I'm going to say no, or withdraw myself from that situation, or cause a big fat fuss that this person is not letting me withdraw that my consent. That should ring alarm bells in a child. If an adult's not going to allow them to withdraw consent, that child should be wanting to fight or flight. Suppressing that fight against that in a child can actually be harmful, because again it suppresses into other trauma responses which are much more compliant, and they end up getting harmed. A fight response is actually an innate one that protects us the best. There's a lot of research to suggest that if you fight in a dangerous situation, you are going to be safer. And especially for a child, obviously they're already more easily overpowered by an adult or by bigger children. But actually, if they have that fight response, they're less likely to get seriously harmed, because a paedophile, a predator is not going to pick out a child that fights. They're just not. They don't want to draw that attention themselves. They don't want any marks or, any evidence that they've done, or they tried to do anything inappropriate. They're going to pick out the child that doesn't fight. They're going to choose the child that doesn't make a fuss. They're going to choose the compliant, obedient child. So creating and reinforcing this innate response is actually helpful for your child. The idea of implied consent is an important one, I think, that we need to understand. Rather than assuming that people always consent, especially in the early stages of a relationship, if we don't know someone as well, or don't know the preferences of the person that we're involved with, or the child, whoever it is, this idea that everything I do is fine is something else we've kind of blanket adopted in society that can be a bit harmful. Obviously, it's a pain to go around and ask if every single thing you do is okay. And that's why we need to have the skill of being able to withdraw consent when something's not okay. And we're not really very good at that often as a society, I don't think, because we want to please, we become people-pleasing society, and we're told that, you know, being obedient and compliant is good, and we don't want to not be good. But actually, being more conscious in the first place to ask if something is okay. Is it okay to touch? Is it okay? Do you want to do this thing? Have this experience? Whatever it is, do you want to do it? Instead of just imposing yourself on someone, opens it out for people to withdraw consent a lot easier. And that would be the ideal, that there's rather than tit for tat, I've done this, you've done that, just opening up a conversation of, do you want to do this and how would you like to do this, as opposed to just doing something and waiting for consent to be withdrawn. So having skills in both areas is really great and really important and really healthy in a relationship, to be able to ask for consent, but also to be able to easily withdraw consent. It's important, I think, to be able to identify how we feel and what we need from our interactions in order to create healthy interactions as an adult. And also even to do that with a child as they're growing, because again, it breeds that comfort around withdrawing consent, asking consent, and taking away this assumed consent, this assumed transaction that often goes on in relationships, that creates these unsafe environments that for a long time now, for generations now, has caused children to be abused again and again in many different scenarios. And as the adults rising who do not want to create environments for children to be abused, this is the sort of thing we need to reinforce. And it's not about control, it's not about compliance and oppression. It's in fact the opposite. It's about bringing awareness to the situation, bringing in that love, that protection, that nurture, to allow us all to be human, to have preferences, to express our preferences, to remove our consent, to give our consent, to ask for consent, and normalize that, to normalize getting clear, gaining clarity, being honest. I hope you found this masterclass helpful and really help to transform your relationships with the children in your life, but also all relationships. As I said, this is something that can adapt to all kinds of relationships, personal relationships and even work relationships, to make them more honest, to make them more open, and to honor your experience, and reinforce that in your child, so that we have healthier relationships all together as we go. I really appreciate your attention. Thank you for joining me. See you again.